All right. Thank you so much, Beth. I'm really happy to be here tonight. And I would like to apologize to everybody because I forgot to hit record before Beth started speaking to capture all of her lovely remarks. Thank you for coming out tonight. For those who do not know me, my name is Brandon. My pronouns are he, him. And I've been working at Jewish Community Action since January of 2020. Funny enough, my start date was January 6th, 2020. So my 1-year anniversary was also a very interesting day in my line of work. Over the last 2.5 years, we've been building a program to go and educate folks in Minnesota and build solidarity around a better understanding of how anti-Semitism functions. For those of you who have been to my 101 trainings before, they're a lot. I'm a talkative individual who really loves history. So those 90-minute trainings are really every single moment of those 90 minutes, but there's a lot. There's a lot to know about how anti-Semitism works historically, how it works today, how it works in conjunction with our very unique situations here in the United States with the internet. Entire books could be written about it. And lucky enough, we are here with Tal Lavin, who has written one of those books. And since Tal's book came out in October of 2020, we have run 2 book clubs at Jewish Community Action examining this text because it does such a fantastic job really outlining the history and catching folks up with online cultures. It is called Culture Warlords right there on Tal's screen. And I highly recommend you check it out. And if enough people email me after this, they want another book club, I will gladly do it. But the biggest things to know about this book are that it catches you up on online culture. If you're not somebody who has grown up on the internet, who has time to stare into the vortex of Twitter and these other places at every moment of the day, it can be a lot. It can be a lot to catch up with. And a lot of the things that are happening out here in the real world, that are happening in politics, that are happening on television, that are happening at our state capitals, our national capital, they're all influenced very much by these discourses that have been evolving over the past 30 years on the internet and are erupting into, I guess, what we call the real world. But the thing is, the internet is the real world. Those are real people on the other ends of those keyboards, on the other ends of those screens. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Tal. Tal, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi. So it's lovely to be here. I've never been to the Twin Cities, but I would love to visit sometime. And in the meantime, digitally porting my way into your bedrooms is a lovely shortcut. I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, which sometimes calls itself Jerusalem on the Hudson. It's a very Orthodox town, and I had that upbringing. And then, my first ever job was for like JTA, the Jewish Newswire. Even though I've sort of moved towards a more secular identity, it's always been a huge part of who I am. And I studied modern Hebrew literature at Harvard, so just a big dork about it. And then around 2017, I was a fact checker at the New Yorker when Unite the Right happened in Charlottesville. And I would say that seeing those Nazis marching through the streets, Jews will not replace us, that was a really galvanizing moment for me. A moment where sort of all of the hate that I had received over the previous 4 years over, my Jewishness, whatever internet nastiness, it just sort of it catalyzed for me this idea that like, this is a force we have to reckon with. And, I think all of us come to a political awakening at different times. I am still ashamed that mine was so late in my life, in my mid-20s, but better late than never. And so I've spent since 2017 very closely tracking the far right in the US, for Media Matters for a time, and then for the book. And now I'm working on a second book, which is also about hate in America. So it's been a mind-bending and often difficult journey, but I've, had the privilege and the pleasure of talking to a lot of different kinds of people all over the country and learning a ton from the sources of the past. And I'm really glad that, people that were in the book club were able to find, hopefully we're able to find some value and satisfaction in the book.
Thank you, Tal. So I would say with these two book clubs, people absolutely found value, and we'll get to what that value is in a bit. But for those who haven't read the book, we have so many people here this evening. I guess we'll probably have to walk folks through what it's all about and kind of what they can glean from your knowledge. But before we get into that, you brought up your own upbringing in Teaneck, New Jersey, and I'd like to invite everybody to sound off in the chat, like what that first time you started like to experience or encounter anti-Semitism, or not even what you clocked as anti-Semitism, just that weird feeling of when for the first time you talked to a non-Jewish person and they kind of treated you different for being Jewish. And for those who aren't Jewish, you can sound off when the first time you realized kind of what anti-Semitism was or was not. Because all of our experiences are different. All of us grew up in very different communities. And I know my experience in Texas in the early 2000s is very different than, let's say, Beth and I's experiences of being, Beth was in Kansas, and that was probably a lot more similar. But I know my experience was a lot different than Tal's. And please, folks, sound off. What was that first time? I'll tell you what mine was. Mine was in high school. This was about the same time that, gosh, it was 2006, and shoot, what was the name of that movie? 300 was really popular. South Park was really big with teenage boys. It still is. But there was this renewed feeling that you could just go and say anti-Semitic stuff, but it's just a joke. And the moment I made the mistake, I suppose, of telling folks at my school, oh, my dad's Jewish, suddenly I started being asked for bags of gold or where my horns are. And they knew that was made up, but they did it anyways. So that's just one example among many.
I mean, I would say my first sort of, I grew up like very much like in an Orthodox enclave, right? So it was like, once I was out in the world, I was like, oh yeah, people get really weird if you're Jewish. So the reason I asked Brandon if we could start with this question is because I wrote an article about Kanye West's anti-Semitism. And I wrote something like tens of millions of Americans have never met a Jew, but every American Jew has had an experience of people getting real weird about them being Jewish. So I just remember this like nightmarish bus ride from Boston to New York. I was sitting next to this guy. I was like finishing a book. This guy sitting next to me had this like Christian tract in his lap and was like very obviously waiting for me to finish my book to talk to me. And then, he starts talking to me about Jesus, and I'm like, well, I'm Jewish. And he's like, oh, like, where I'm from in Missouri, like a lot of people don't like Jews, but I think like God gave your people a gift with money. And I'm like, and it's just that very particular moment where you're like, oh boy, I'm outnumbered and people don't really know, like a very muddled reputation precedes me. So when I put this out in the world, like I just got this huge response from Jews, from all over the country, saying the horns motif comes up a lot. But like, all these weird experiences they'd had. And I thought, we often don't contextualize. We play down, we minimize things that happen to us. we don't necessarily recognize them as something with a historical context. And I thought it would really anchor things, you know, if we all just like talked about our experiences. Of course, if it's something traumatic that you don't want to share with a bunch of strangers, that's also fine. Yeah, it looks like we've hearing people being called Jew boy, worried about being converted to Judaism. Jews killed Jesus. Oh boy, someone grew up in Colorado Springs, the hotbed of evangelicalism, not being allowed to play with their neighbors because their mom came in to talk about Hanukkah. People witnessing anti-Semitism during the George Floyd uprising, Nazi flags, lots of anti-Semitism among Southern Baptist churches, apocalyptic Christian Zionist prophecy, unwelcome invitations to Christmas dinner. So yeah, I mean, it seems like we've all had these moments where we're like, you know, stop being weird. Stop being weird about me being a Jew, or just like stop being overtly hostile because I don't, worship Jesus. Moments where you really feel a sense of precarity in a Christian supremacist country. I'll just add that, like, particularly in this post-Roe world where you have these explicitly like violating of Jewish law, like laws about abortion and bodily autonomy, it's a particularly stark time to be a religious minority. But yeah, just one interesting note about the whole Jews have horns myth. It stems from a mistranslation of a line in like Exodus 34. The Hebrew is something like, and like Moshe had like karnaim on his face, and that it can mean like rays of light or radiance. It can also mean horns elsewhere in the Torah, but like it was like Moses' face shone with radiance got translated in the Vulgate as like the skin of Moses's face had horns on it. And so there are a lot of ancient, like Michelangelo sculpted Moses with horns and stuff. So it's just weird how, I mean, obviously there's an association with the devil and stuff, but the whole Jews have horns stuff really comes from like a bad mistranslation of the Bible.
So I'm really glad that that you mentioned Christian supremacy so early in our time together, because when I do our anti-Semitism and white nationalism 101 trainings, one of the things that I start folks off with is a quick just how did we get here, of just like what's the last 400 years of history like, walking us through. All right, we've got enclosures, we've got colonialism, we have slavery, but then keeping in mind how European colonialism has this distinctly Christian aspect to it. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what Christian supremacy is? Because when we hear supremacy, sometimes folks can think that means like a specific extremist group, rather than maybe a more academic term or a nebulous term.
I mean, I guess people use it in different ways. To me, it signifies just like this social milieu in which the default assumption is that people are Christian, that any sort of exception to that is viewed as abnormal or even dangerous, or just simply not considered as a possibility. I think one of the really most illustrative things about Christian supremacy is like how hard it is to persuade people that Christian is not a synonym for good. How hell-bent like liberal Christians are to say like, oh, the people who, are advocating for ethno-nationalism, et cetera, are not real Christians, because real Christians are morally, perfect. And it's kind of like, well, looking at this from a non-Christian perspective, I'm like, they worship, Christ. So it seems like they're Christian. I think what you mean is you don't morally agree with them. And then it seems to bend people's minds that like two non-Christians, Christian and good, are not synonymous. I'm like, you guys were killing Jews. Like, I don't know, was the Pope not a Christian when he ordered a pogrom? Like, what are you talking about here?
Yeah, we can't pick and choose which bits of history happened. If people are saying it, we still have to go and hold people within our communities or who claim to be part of our communities accountable.
Yeah, yeah. I see people are sharing more experiences, and I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, so we live in this sort of unabashedly Christian supremacist country. And as religious minorities, it's like in the particular position of Jews, like dealing with weird Christian philo-Semitism, like, like you're really useful in our vision of the end of the world. So like, we're going to cozy up to you and also do seders at our churches and like bring shofars to our like anti-democratic protest marches. Like it's just really weird and really uncomfortable. And we're in this particular precarious moment coming up to the midterms. It just feels, I mean, at least to me, and maybe that's because I spend so much time kind of with my head in the most acidic corners of politics, but it seems to me we're in this moment like rife with this like facade of potential violence. And to me it's neither coincidental nor a very good thing that we're seeing a rise in public anti-Semitism at this moment.
So on that, that staring into this abyss of the internet, can you tell us a little bit about your book and that how you started that project? What got you into it? And because I know for me, at least from the sidelines, I've been watching yourself and so many other researchers and journalists who do a heck of a lot more than I do, researching these movements and going into these online spaces. And people sometimes think that I know everything about this, when in reality, I'm just following what y'all are doing. So what got you into this? How did you get into this type of research and then into these spaces?
Well, like I said, after Unite the Right, there was this moment where I was like, okay, like the Rilke poem, like you must change your life. And I really just turned all of my focus as a, writer. At the time I was a fact checker, but I really turned a lot of my focus onto writing about hate and hate groups. And so my first article on the subject was about the Daily Stormer, which is sort of an infamous neo-Nazi website. After Charlottesville, they found themselves kind of getting kicked off different all these different domains. They had trouble keeping a stable site. So I said they're wandering the wilderness, wink. And of course they wound up writing about me. Jewish whale, blah, 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 makes me wish like there had been a real Holocaust, lampshade, all this stuff. And I think that's a point where a lot of people would have been like, I'm gonna like peace out. And that would have been a perfectly reasonable decision. Just for me, I'm a very like stubborn, pig-headed person. I'm also like perpetually in this battle with my anxiety and being like, I'm not a coward. even if I get panic attacks sometimes. So I'm going to prove how not a coward I am by just like absolutely wrecking my own mental health. So I started writing the book in like late 2018, and then throughout 2019 and most of 2020. And I actually started out wanting to do more traditional journalism, like calling people up and, talking to them in the normal way. But my reputation preceded me as someone who had been like writing in an anti-fascist way and speaking in an anti-fascist way. My name is also like very obviously Jewish. So I found myself being like turned away from organization after organization. And after a certain point, I sort of said, okay, well, I've got to figure out some way of reaching these groups, of talking to people. So I wound up going in the back door and using lots of different pseudonyms and different identities to get into forums and chats and, just listening to the rank and file of kind of the white supremacists and incels and different forms of extremists online and like what they talk about, how they talk about, recruitment, how they got, radicalized. And in the end, I found that kind of fly on the wall perch was a very valuable and interesting way of getting to understand this movement. The specifically like online far right.
So as you were researching all of this, at least in your book, you give us so much context about how these movements have a historical basis where they're coming from this long arc of history, but also this shorter term. And I think for a lot of folks here tonight, a lot of this feels like it started with Charlottesville, or it started with that moment in 2015 when Donald Trump came down that escalator. But it actually started earlier than that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what these online movements look like? I'm at least thinking about like, for me, when I started seeing it as just an online younger person, like I really saw it when Gamergate exploded and became like the only thing on the internet for like 3 whole weeks or more. But aspects of it kind of started before that. Can you give us a little bit of background about like where this came from?
I mean, do you want the 1,000-year version, the 100-year version?
Let's do the 100-year version. Let's start with Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say this, like, anti-Semitism is a very old feature of Western culture. I'm going to do the like very short 1,000-year version, which is just that you can go back to the 1100s and find anti-Semitisms, iterations of anti-Semitism that have, continuity with the anti-Semitism we see today on the internet. What's very consistent through like the blood libel, idea that Jews sort of kill Christian children and either drink their blood in a perversion of the sacrament or put it in matzah, or the Black Death era sort of accusations that Jews had sort of gotten together as a community, decided to poison the wells of Christian Europe in an act of revenge, and like done so with sort of secret sachets of poison. And this resulted in pogroms that wiped out most of the Jewish population of Bavaria and other places. To right now, what you see is this over and over again, this theme of the cabal. Jews gathering together to scheme, to do evil, and then enacting it. So using this as an explanation for social ailments, like for example, the Black Death. And So that's a powerful European force. It's a powerful force in Western culture that has abided for a millennium. And so, it just like the what do you call the melody stays the same. It just gets like covered in different ways. Um, and by the turn of the 20th century, we see the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Tsarist forgery coming out of Russia, which took the idea of poisoning wells and turned it into poisoning the world. It's this sort of ersatz, minutes of a meeting of the secret cabal of Jews, like saying like, we are going to destroy the Goyen by, infiltrating their culture and such and such. It's actually very easy to find on the internet, and it is worth reading, just in the sense that like so much of it is foundational to contemporary anti-Semitism and has sort of persisted unchanged in many ways. The other big landmark in American anti-Semitism came in the 1920s, where you had Henry Ford, industrialist and absolute jackass, beloved of the Nazis, used some of his auto wealth to buy the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper. And he ran this series of columns, which included printing, like huge portions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but also lots of new stuff on its own, like Jews control the media, Jews are just corrupting us with jazz. Henry Ford, like, literally was so paranoid about like the Jewish Black interaction that was jazz, that he like sponsored square dances around the country, and is the reason why there's like a lot of public square dancing in American public schools. Fun fact, it's because Henry Ford was anti-Semitic. Anyway, those columns got published as a 4-volume book called The International Jew, which was distributed widely, translated into 12 different languages, influenced the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a strong US Nazi sympathizer crew, the sort of stay out of the war, America first sloganeers, sure, but also like legitimately German Nazis, or like either Nazis of German descent or sympathizers. Famously, they gathered together in 1939 at Madison Square Garden. And the police like held back a bunch of really angry Jews trying to beat them up. But in terms of like tracing back the specific online origins of the movement, I would say it's always important to consider that like there is historical continuity. Anti-Semitism per se in and of itself, like, really doesn't change in its elements, of sort of postulating that social ailments are caused by Jewish scheming, by Jewish racial solidarity, by unnatural cunning, etc. There are a lot of very common themes that run, I mean, literally a millennium or more. But if we look at, it's like, one of the interesting things is that the extremist right, the Klan, neo-Nazis, etc., have often been like very voracious early technology adopters. And so the Klan was like one of the first organizations in America to have a website. In the 1970s and 80s, white supremacist terror had moved away from kind of these centrally organized groups into a movement that's a movement style that's sort of called leaderless resistance, a more common sort of terrorist cell style where it's like nobody really knows all the plans, doesn't reside, with everyone. We're just going to put out propaganda to influence people to do violence. So, and the Klan very early on realized that the internet is a really useful way to reach people in their homes without having to like bring them out and make them kind of vulnerable in the way that you are when you physically gather. So, I mean, as soon as the internet became a widespread technology, like the far right started using it to organize, to spread propaganda. And so you've had, message boards like stormfront.org, which is linked to like over 100 hunters. Its descendants like the Daily Stormer, and of course, all of the texts of anti-Semitism, of racism, of eugenics are available readily online on Wikisource or whatever, which is useful like for me as a researcher, but also, you see neo-Nazis like passing around these links. So, it's an interesting time. And I would also add, just like in terms of more recent developments, like the social fracturing and isolation of the pandemic really caused a wild acceleration in anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism, being as old as it is, the oldest of Western conspiracy theories by far, sort of forms the kind of text of all other conspiracy theories. It's the template. And so many, many, many conspiracy theories like lead you back to anti-Semitism in turn. So for example, like I went to like a flat earth message board, and like I was just like, what's this all about? And literally within one click, it was like NASA is a Jewish conspiracy. And I'm like, really? I thought like you guys saying the earth was flat was like just kind of fun. And then it's like, no, like
the birds aren't real stuff.
Like the round earth is a Jewish conspiracy. I'm like, what? This is our fault too? Because matzo balls are like, what? It's just, yeah. Anyway, I just said a lot very fast. But and it's okay if you liked square dancing in elementary school. Like square dancing is cool. It's just like, I don't know. A lot of things happen for dumb reasons and bad reasons, and then change into their own stuff. I think you're like allowed to listen to jazz without it being like an evil corruption of American youth.
What a bold statement. So one of the things that that you mentioned about how the pandemic really accelerated things, and of course in your book you talk a lot about like what is accelerationism, which is more than just accelerating things. But I'm thinking from our own context in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. We were at the very heart of the uprisings in 2020, and I remember seeing my first Boogaloo Boys on the ground, and then for months, people coming to my trainings would ask me, "Well, you got to tell us about this group. Are they a group?" And it was so strange. One, having to go and explain how what used to be a cheeky joke that was beloved by many older millennials and younger Gen Xers as just a unneeded sequel, something to Electric Boogaloo, turned into a specific call for a race war. I think that was probably one of the most shockingly fast accelerations I saw of what was at first a meme that I knew was out there, but then it became something that I started seeing in spaces that I'd never expected it. Spots that were, places where Bernie people like to hang out. And at first it started as that joke, if things are so bad, we're going to have a second civil war. And then suddenly, once they shared that one meme, that algorithm started spitting out, you liked this meme. Other people who shared that meme also shared this one. And then slowly, I guess not so slowly, pretty quickly, I started seeing some pretty clearly anti-Semitic things getting shared by people. So I guess it's a tangential way to go and ask, what is accelerationism, and how have you seen like online culture shift just in these couple of short years?
Yeah, I mean, so accelerationism is actually a neither left nor right political term. It's I can't remember where exactly it originated in like the 80s, I think, on the left. But it's this idea that basically we can't accomplish like the true and lasting change we desire within the system. So we have to like encourage chaos to like tear the system down so we can start anew, and create the world we want to see. And that can look a lot of different ways. I would say that it has like relatively little purchase in American leftism right now, for better or for worse. Um, on the right, it's just like we are going to do a lot of terrorism with the goal of destabilizing like society enough that we can, enact mass violence, start a race war, and like create a white ethno state on the ruins of, you know, American multiracial democracy. It's like a very open uh, fantasy that they have, and a lot of that, like, I mean, so some of the sources for that kind of vision include uh, this guy James Mason wrote this series of pamphlets called Siege, which were about like how to engage in lots of terrorism to destabilize American society and create a white ethno state. There's also very famously the Turner Diaries, really shitty, like badly written novel that I had to read for research about kind of like a post-apocalyptic future where white terrorists, you're sort of following the hero who is a white terrorist, get together and, are fighting for the American future. And like, they famously enact like what's called the Day of the Rope, where they hang Jews, journalists, Black people, anyone who they perceive as sort of enemies of the white race. So Day of the Rope is something that comes up a lot. Like, as just like people will say it as a threat to journalists. People will send you an emoji of rope or whatever. And or DOTR is like an acronym for it. I mean, and just like to talk about the Boogaloo Boys specifically, I mean, I think it's a really good example of how like things that are online and foment online don't stay online. And how, these hate groups use seemingly inscrutable code that's very sort of cheeky, very internet savvy, very digital native to kind of cloak themselves in plausible deniability, because it is silly, right? So the origin is this breakdancing movie called Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, which is, yeah, as you mentioned, the has been used as sort of the, like, for a long time as a meme, as like just like you know a silly or unnecessary sequel. So like you'd say like, X2 Electric Boogaloo or whatever. So the implication here is Civil War 2 Electric Boogaloo, right? Take every context out of it and just call yourself a Boogaloo boy, right? Then they started wearing Hawaiian shirts because Boogaloo kind of sounds like big luau. They adopted all this kind of like ancillarily, like barely sort of connected iconography, and started showing up with like machine guns at protests. So everything's all like goofy and light and weird until you have the like guys militating for civil war showing up, at protests. So you also had like a guy in California who identified as a Boogaloo boy and was part of a chapter over there, like, shoot a whole bunch of people. Um, so, all of this stuff is, and I do want to just mention one thing. So, like, yes, there is an algorithmic element to this. It's like once you start sharing certain kinds of content, that's what the YouTube and Facebook and Twitter or whatever think you like. Sure. There's also a network effect, and I learned this from reading the work of a wonderful a scholar named Becca Lewis. So she's written about how it's not just the algorithm, like the algorithm has a role, but also white supremacists like all know each other. They appear on each other's channels, they, appear as guests, they do like debates. So that there's a, part of the way that you get led to more and more radicalized content is because these radical content creators know each other and like deliberately lead you down these corridors and say like, hey, you might also like this other guy, neo-Nazi Jet Skull 88, whatever. And again, like there are lots of different ways that this happens. There are fascist podcasts, there's really terrible white nationalist rap. Like white nationalism in music is like a whole other, like there can and have been books about it. So I'm not an expert in that. But I mean, like there's white nationalist religious groups, like there are Telegram chats for white supremacists who want to talk about like their diets and workout, but in a racist way. Or like preparing to be self-sufficient after the race war and like learning how to like plant crops or stockpiling ammo or whatever. I mean, there is like a whole other world within the sort of confines of racism, of white nationalism, people who identify with that movement.
So with that, gosh, you mentioned two things that I want to ask questions about, but they're very different. First off, Becca Lewis, I think is the person I quote. Oddly enough, the thing I quote most from your book when I'm teaching stuff about these movements and these systems is actually from Becca Lewis, and that is everything is Gamergate.
Mm-hmm.
And so question one is in 2014 we had Gamergate and the explosive growth of incels. Can you tell folks just a little bit about what that is and why everything is Gamergate? And then I guess a second question, which we can come back to after that, is that aspect of that alienation and loneliness that is present for pretty much everybody in our society, but how a lot of these fascist movements capitalize on it very effectively at times. So first off, Gamergate. Why is everything Gamergate?
Yeah, so for those of you who might not be familiar with it, Gamergate was a online shitstorm in 2014 where like it started with basically an ex-boyfriend of a female game developer accused her of sleeping with a games journalist for good reviews, which was a lie. It was a lie from the start. But it just exploded into this sort of months-long community of sort of white men who identified themselves as gamers, working to delegitimize, destroy, harass, dox, SWAT, just torment anyone in gaming or gaming related spaces who was not a white man. So, women were certainly the target, women of color, people of color. If you were a journalist, if you were a developer, if you were, even just like someone who might like stand up and say like, no, there should be a role for women in the world of games. You could be a target. And the reason why Becca says everything is Gamergate is because this was where a lot of like the contemporary methods of expressing hate and targeting and tormenting people on the internet were sort of beta tested, where people were testing the limits. What can we do without repercussions? And the answer turned out to be like an awful lot, right? It galvanized a lot of people, a lot of young men, who had their first sort of taste of how good it can feel to bully people, how good it can feel to express hatred, how righteous and truthful it can feel, or how you can feel like you're in community when you are targeting people for harassment together. And so a lot of these techniques like doxing, posting someone's private details online, swatting, calling in, false, calling in SWAT teams because you report like, oh, this person, has a gun and is killing their family, right? And that person is just sort of chilling at home, and then a SWAT team comes in, guns drawn, right? It is a crime, but it was done a lot. And suddenly you had people whose only crime was like being female and enjoying video games. They were like on the run, staying in hotels, being sort of terrified of having their locations revealed. And so in subsequent years, like the focus has been less on gaming specifically, although there are a lot of like white men who claim the identity of gamer and are very ferocious about it. Um, but it's become like the same toolkit is used for transphobia, and harassing trans people in public, like uh the same tool set is used for harassing Jews, like and a lot of the same people who became like these prominent voices in Gamergate have become, leaders or activists within racist and white nationalist movements. Incels are sort of a separate movement. It stands for involuntarily celibate. Uh, it's this um it actually was originally coined by like a Canadian lesbian, I think, but like and it was very quickly adopted by exclusively like reactionary men who blame women for their lack of sexual success. While at the same time just like wallowing in some of the absolute most putrid misogyny you can possibly imagine. They obsess over hatred of women and like um it is like looking at their spaces online, it's an example of misogyny, like pure misogyny, because white nationalists recruit a lot in incel spaces because they're like, here's a bunch of young angry men. But incels are of all different colors and from different communities. One incel message board that I spent some time on like did a little poll of its user base, and it was like 60-40 white non-white, but like it's a lot of non-white people. But it's sort of pure misogyny as a motivating force, right? A force of violence. So there's constant talk of suicide, constant talk about how like the only true reality is despair. And there have been a number of terrorist incidents, some with significant death tolls that have arisen out of that movement. Sort of most famously, the Santa Barbara massacre committed by Elliot Rodger, who wrote this like extremely long and tendentious and poorly written manifesto about how he was going to kill as many women as possible because they wouldn't sleep with him, the perfect gentleman. So among incel communities, to go ER, to go Elliot Rodger means like that day you snap and decide to kill women. So there have been terrorist incidents in a yoga studio. There was Alec Minassian, a self-proclaimed incel in Toronto, who killed 8 women by running them over with a van. Like, there's a very potent force driving people to violence. And like looking at these communities, I was really struck by the fact that one, like, this is misogyny in its purest, most vitriolic form. Like their fantasies all involve mass rape and enslavement of women, as the sort of solution to their sexual woes. And also that like this is a very good example of a sort of self-perpetuating radicalization machine. A perpetual radicalization machine is like something I call some of these spaces where it's like there's no moderating influence. It's just people sort of egging each other on to get more and more and more and more extreme, discuss more and more violent scenarios. And even to the point where, you had people saying, I'm going to kill myself tonight. And, the responses being like, see you in Valhalla, no one's saying, hey, maybe don't do that. It was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's part of our worldview. So it's just like this very extreme environment. And incels are a pretty pure example of that, but certainly like perpetual motion radicalization machines exist in different corners of the far right internet, like all over.
thank you for walking us through those two big moments that happened in 2014 that are still affecting us. And I want to make sure that folks think about 2014 may feel like it was just yesterday for a lot of us, but that was 8 years ago. And for young people who are in their early 20s, that's when they were in high school. So a lot of people who are in college, entering college, just left college, if they were online, they encountered fallout from these spaces if they did not directly witness it. These things are ubiquitous. Many young people, regardless of whether or not they know somebody who directly identifies as an incel or is in incel forums, it's just a word young people go and kind of say, like, that person gives off incel vibes. So it's something that people are familiar with, even if they're not necessarily familiar with all of the aspects. And I think that's a really important thing for folks who have young people in their lives. If you've never really engaged with online culture, just talk to the young people in your lives and have them tell you about what they've seen, because they've seen different things than you have, and we learn from each other. And with that,
And
this
yeah,
is
like some of the most gratifying feedback I've gotten from readers is like, I shared this with my kid and like we used it to talk about, what they've seen on the internet. And like, I'm not, I'm 33 and I feel like I'm, ancient, very tired. But like, I tried to write the book in like a non-academic, like sort of, I'm just talking to you kind of register, here's who I am, and like here's the fucked up shit I've seen. And like I think just like especially as more and more spaces online get dominated by right-wing voices. So like YouTube is particularly egregious about this, like, these far right channels are like very well funded and also like network with each other really well. Twitter was just bought by Elon Musk and is about to get like a whole lot more reactionary than it already is, which is quite a bit. It's very hard to avoid on social media the sort of drift and pull towards right wing and far right ideas. And like this is something that kids are constantly being bombarded with. And particularly misogynist influencers. Misogyny is a deadly hatred in and of itself. It's also, as we say, like a gateway hatred. Like very often people start out with like frustrations about sex or like frustrations about like the like hideous gender wars that male form our society at all times, and start there and like wind up on a very dark journey. And that happens all the time, every day, to teenage boys in particular. And like when you look at who the perpetrators of these acts of domestic terrorism are, including the Tree of Life shooting, overwhelmingly these like very young men, 18, 19, 20, 21. um you know uh, these are ages where the combination of online radicalization and very real access to weaponry can have like really fatal and terrible tragic results. So when we talk about you know talking to the young people in your life about what they're seeing online, maybe even like delicately checking their browsing history. I mean, I don't advocate for an authoritarian parenting style. It's more just like talk to your kid. It's probably worth a chat about what they're being exposed to, um, because it's hard to navigate on your own. Like one of the things that I always try to emphasize in my work is the human motivations behind um, the things that I study, right? Extremism. And just like the human motivations are very simple. People feel alone, right? And they want community. People feel confused and they want understanding. People feel beset or just like they haven't gotten their due. They feel discontented. And so they search for explanations that absolve them. And it's sort of an old quote. It's been bandied about. I think it was first said by like a German social democrat in like the 1800s. It was anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. It's just like kind of like why does my job suck? Why is my life small? It's because of the Jews, as opposed to as a shorthand that like very neatly cuts off like the need for any more sophisticated power analysis, right? Or examining like inequality in a more nuanced way. It's like, these hate groups offer a sense of community, a sense of purpose, like stand with your white brothers and save the white race, right? It's all cast in these very apocalyptic terms. We see it, now in the mainstream right wing with like this obsession with, somehow every trans person is a pedophile, and like the schools are pedophilically like making your kids trans, obsessively bringing up pedophilia and even demon worship. Like this is like mainstream conservative rhetoric at this point. But it's this idea of like you can be part of a group that is saving the world. You can defeat your enemies if you simply act, right? You are important. You are you are a soldier. There's purpose to your life. You have comrades, and all of the reasons why your life doesn't look the way it is, like here are the people who are at fault for the reasons that you're unhappy with your life. And like holistically, that's like a pretty appealing set of things to offer. And you can see why people fall into these, explanations so eagerly and wholeheartedly. And then getting out, or like once you're in, first of all, it becomes your whole world. These spaces are very obsessive. These spaces are very intense. They, demand constant engagement, right? Sometimes you get kicked out if you haven't talked in 24 hours, right? And often, like the more into sort of racism and anti-Semitism you become, you may alienate other people in your life. Certainly not with like QAnon and other.
Sorry, we can't quite hear you.
Sorry. Certainly we've seen this with like QAnon and other conspiracy theories, people describing losing relatives, right? So the more into these sort of theories you get, the more you spew racist bile and anti-Semitism at any given moment, the more you may alienate people in your real life. So it becomes more important. And also, these are very violent spaces. It's not like it's just like super easy to get out. Like you have to, you leave at your own peril, right? So I hear people talk about de-radicalization a lot. Certainly when my book came out, like I had a chapter about like why anti-fascism is actually good. And people were like, you hate free speech. And I'm like, no, I think that when you give white nationalists a platform, you are like offering them free recruiting opportunities, and like, giving hate a voice isn't just like about some grand neutral principle. Like it is a silencing of minorities. when you give white nationalist hate a platform, you are making it unsafe for others to speak. Like yeah, so I'm not a free speech absolutist, I'll just say it. Like I think the SPLC was wrong to like allow that march in Skokie. Wouldn't have been my call. And they sued to let Unite the Right go forward, and like a woman died. So, and a lot of other people were injured in ways that like, both physically and psychically. So yeah, I mean, I guess, I forgot what I was saying.
No problem. I've got one last question from me for you, and I want to give folks an opportunity to ask, drop questions in the chat. And because we have a little bit of time left, and I would love to get folks' thoughts. But I imagine one thought that many people may have a question about is what's been going on with all this Kanye stuff. How does it work within this ecosystem you've described? I know you've written a couple of pieces the last 2 weeks, but I imagine many people probably signed up for this event thinking, maybe I'll learn a little bit more about what's going on with all this Kanye and Trump stuff the last week.
I mean, the thing about it, it's just like, I will just go back to something I said earlier, which is like, with anti-Semitism, it's like the means of delivery might be novel, that it's like on a podcast or whatever, or on Truth Social, Trump's proprietary Twitter clone. But you know, like, it's just the same shit, different year. Jews control this, Jews control that. I mean, specifically it's Kanye being like, Jews are the reason why people think I'm unstable, or like, Jews have sexualized my ex-wife, who is literally Kim Kardashian. Like, it's just like very transparent, like, here's someone to blame, right, for all the ways my life doesn't look the way it is. Like with Kanye, I think there's also like a mental illness element, friends who have bipolar have described sort of in moments of mania there being paranoid thinking, and so obviously lends itself to conspiracy. Like, Trump has illustrated his signature contempt for Jews recently, and indulged in some like pretty sloppy encomiums to Christian Zionism, which is inherently anti-Semitic, because it basically pictures like Jews as pawns on a chessboard to like be moved to Israel to be set up for like mass conversion and or death during the apocalypse. So it's not like a super Jew friendly movement. Yeah, I mean, it's just, again, it's like do one reading of the International Jew or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or like any of these foundational anti-Semitic texts, or chapter 1 of Culture Warlords, and you'll just recognize the same themes again and again and again and again and again. The theme of the cabal, theme of outsized power, this theme of sort of Jews versus the world, racial cunning and solidarity, unnatural skills, and then very often like a Christian religious element of sort of Jesus killers, or closeness with the devil, or even like modern iterations of a blood libel. I mean, it's just like, it's so old and it just keeps getting remixed, because like it is perennially useful to the powerful to just like have an easy shorthand for people to blame, right? Like, and like, it's very uncomfortable to be a member of the group that people are like, you're the reason why the world is bad, and I'm like, no, I didn't do anything.
Yeah, and like one of the most insidious parts of it is how that German social democrats thing about how anti-Semitism is the anti-capitalism of fools. Like, in the modern incarnations of anti-Semitism, that aspect of power that's described, it gets a little close to describing, all right, there's a lot of conglomerated power out there in the world. Like, things aren't working out. Wow, maybe mass media, like being owned by 5 companies, isn't great. Then it just shortcuts and veers right off track and says, no, guess what? It's the Jews. It's not maybe our legal system. Maybe it's set up in weird ways. Maybe we can reform things. Nope, it's just the Jews.
Yeah. And Tess Dornfeld, by the way, is right. I totally slandered the SPLC, who are generally great, and I have friends who work there. I meant the ACLU. Had sort of free speech absolutism as like a cornerstone. I think they still somewhat do, but have had a reckoning in the last several years where they're like, maybe like being sort of fighting for the legal rights of Nazis isn't like where we should put our like big money right now. I think like another really simple example of like free speech absolutism being just super dumb was like Penn State University, like this week, like allowed a openly fascist student group which is like, by the way, fine and allowed on campus, called Uncensored America, to invite Gavin McInnes, the co-founder of the Proud Boys, which is again a national like street fighting fascist gang, to like come speak on campus. And like very predictably, Proud Boys showed up and maced a bunch of students who had showed up to be like, no, we don't want a fascist gang leader speaking on our campus. So the event was canceled at like the very last minute, but like literally only after Proud Boys had like, maced a bunch of students and like started beating them. Like, and it was like, you know, you don't have a requirement to like invite the fascist gang leader. Why don't you expel all those students in the fascist student group instead? I mean, that's more where I'm at, where I'm like, no, like, again, like when you say free speech, free speech, free speech, what you're usually saying is like, I am making a choice to like make this space less safe for the targets of these people. Like there
So
is always
speaking
a
of,
choice that you're
oh,
making.
sorry, Tal. I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions in the chat, and one came up a little earlier, so I want to make sure that we get to it. Abby, and it's related. Abby noted that she was undercover in similar online spaces, was doxxed, had neo-Nazi come to her home on a kill list. I mean, the things that you've experienced as well. And Abby wonders what type of safety measures you recommend, or what kind of safety measures do you have in place for yourself? What do you recommend for others who are in that space? And then what do you recommend for the rest of us who are just, you know, Jews?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, kudos to Abby for exposing a neo-Nazi to his workplace. Like that kind of exposing, which they will call doxing, but it's like, to me, unless you're posting someone's home address or like their family, you're not actually doxing someone. Like you may be like keeping them from operating pseudonymously, but that's not the same as doxing, right? Yeah, I'm so sorry that you went through, you know, that kind of terrifying experience with someone coming to your home. You know, I've been on a kill list before too. Some of the security measures I have in place, I use a service called Delete Me. It's pretty expensive, but like I find it really useful. It scrubs your address and phone number from all those sort of like online databases like White Pages and Spokio and People Search, you know, where someone can just like sign up for $2 and search for people. So with the aid of that, I've been able to keep my address from being easily searched. Unfortunately, like my parents like bought an apartment, so the realty records were like online, so people found my parents' address. It sucks. Like there's a limit to what you can do. But Delete Me is a great place to start. You can also put your whole family on it. You know, there are family plans. So I have all my sisters and my parents like on my Delete Me account. To me, it is money well spent and necessary, given that like they didn't set out to call the storm onto their heads and I'm the only one doing this mishigas, right? I also, when I am somewhere, if I want to post a photo, right, I wait till I've left. I'm very cagey about where I live. You know, if I make a podcast appearance or if I, you know, I'm even like speaking on TV or whatever, I just like, I won't say my borough. I just say I'm in New York City, right? I like intentionally lie about my borough. In fact, like I don't live in Brooklyn anymore. But whatever. I live where I live, a mysterious borough somewhere in the New York tri-state area. You know, so that kind of thing where you're a little cagey. Always turn on two-factor authentication for any, you know, service you use. That's like text me, you know, if I'm logging in from a new device or whatever. Makes it harder for people to impersonate you and take your passwords and personal information. What else do I do on a regular basis for security? I like don't mention my family in public at all, ever. Really. And then like, so those are some just basic security measures. I think it might be extreme for just like the average Jew, the average Yoel. But like, I think Delete Me is a very useful service for everyone. And I also think just like practicing, two-factor authentication is very useful and very easy to set up on most sites. Possibly using a password manager so you're not just like, reusing the same password everywhere you go. Just like basic digital security stuff will aid you in this arena as well. The other thing is like to recognize that, especially if you start engaging in activism, like you will get some amount of shit. And like make sure you have a support system in place to help you handle it, and it just sort of comes with the territory.
Thanks, that's helpful. And those are really good reminders about what we should be doing all the time, just as humans living in the world to keep ourselves safe. I really, I think it's a great reminder to just wait to post pictures till you're gone. I mean, that's simple and smart. So I will be doing
I
that.
mean, not
Thank
everyone
you.
has my situation where I defriended my entire family on all social media and I'm like, don't comment on my stuff, don't talk to me, don't
Yeah.
say that you are related to me.
Yeah.
But like them's the breaks, and it goes with the territory of like writing about shitheads. It's like I get interested in you.
Yeah.
I was a neo-Nazi Marine who was like in machine gun training. It was like, this is gonna come back and hurt you. And I'm like, like I've had the FBI come to my door and be like, people want to kill and rape you. I'm like, yeah, where have you been? But yeah, no, and Kev Falls, the streamer who got Kiwi Farm shut down, like so scary. Like those people are fucking insane and obsessive, and like they like figured out what hotel she was staying in from like the bed sheets of a screenshot she posted. Like it's scary out there. So yeah, keep in mind that like a lot of photos that aren't like tight crop shots of your face or whatever can be geolocated. Like do not allow like location services on any app. But I don't know, I started collecting swords. But I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, although they are beautiful.
So we've got one more question up in the chat a little bit that I want to make sure we get to before we start wrapping up a little bit. But Gus asks, what do you think are the places or processes by which Christian supremacy gets explicitly perpetuated in schools?
I mean, gosh, like I didn't go to I went to like an Orthodox Jewish school. So like I might not be the right person to ask, but I mean like One Nation Under God, right? Like Christ, right? I think a lot of it is interpersonal also, but also it's like what holidays do you have off, right? Christmas, Easter, whatever. So that's certainly part of it. It's not like everyone has a Rosh Hashanah off, all over the country. Then I mean it's just like, I'm not trying to say it's a vibe, but it's more just like the sort of broad social assumption that everybody is Christian by default. And this is something that like, happens in individual classrooms and school wide, in different, like lots and lots of different ways and lots and lots of different little interactions. Yeah, it also is a vibe. And also that fucking book, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which I think should be like just thrown into the sea, every single copy, and like go read Eli Wiesel or just like literally anything else other than this like fantasy of like all goyim were actually kind of good and we're fine. Like that disgusting Christian centric book. I hate it. But yeah, it happens in lots of different ways.
Oh, that's a great
Rachel,
question,
you're
Rachel.
yeah, like, so David Baddiel, who's this British comedian, wrote this book, Jews Don't Count. I don't necessarily agree with him. Like, he's to the right of me on a lot of different things, but he talks about sort of the unique nature of anti-Semitism. Deborah Lipstadt is another person who is, like, again, to the right of me, but she particularly has a lot to say that's quite interesting. I think people tend to, again, like, dismiss anti-Semitism because they say it's like Jews are powerful and we're punching up, really, when we say shit. And it's like, you just say, like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, we are a tiny minority. We're, we don't have, like, guns. We don't have power. Like, if the American polity decided to wipe out its Jewish community, that would happen in a matter of months. Like, so, why are you comfortable with, like this open slander of, like, a group that's less than 2% of the US population, unless you believe in, like, anti-Semitic precepts, like the fact that we are the underlying power behind it. Which isn't to say the Jewish community isn't, like, racist and doesn't have its own, doesn't have its own issues. And, like, you know what, like, Kanye should have been dropped by Adidas for his anti-blackness. But, like, I think a lot of the premises that keep people from taking anti-Semitism seriously are themselves evidence of anti-Semitism. And it's like, oh, like, the fact that, like, with the Kanye stuff, it really is just, like, such an example of this, like, bind where it's like, yeah, like, this fucking asshole who's, like, talking about wanting to kill all the Jews, like, we are mad at him and do not like him. But, like, when that kind of influence campaign succeeds, it's evidence that Jews are all powerful and, like, he was right all along. It's a mess. Like, I think there's racism within the Jewish community. Certainly very evident where I grew up. I think there's, like, anti-Black racism is a huge problem and a fundamental, like like premise of the US. But, like, these are not separate problems. Like, once you look, especially in, like, the actual, like, neo-Nazi and far-right communities, like, anti-Semitism is sort of their like zeitgeist. It's the sort of armature by which they explain why everything is the way it is, and, like, their racism is intimately intertwined with anti-Semitism. They talk about Black people and minorities being dupes of the Jews. If you've heard of, like, white genocide theory or, like, great replacement theory, it's this idea that, like, global elites, Jews, are replacing white people with, minorities, right? And it's this conspiracy. So again, like, you can't so readily detach the anti-Semitism of the far right and of these theories from their racism. Like, these are things that are intimately interconnected. So if you oppose one, you should oppose the other.
Right, Tal, and that's
And
basically, I mean, that's how we started the conversation tonight too, and that we have to, we can't do this work in isolation, and we can't do it alone, and we have to do it in deep relationship and in collaboration with all marginalized communities, or else we don't win. Which kind of brings us to Amy's question, which is the last question, and tees up perfectly what we were hoping to do, which is to say, okay, other than talking to our kids, what do we do about this? We have just learned a lot of stuff that could prevent all of us from sleeping from now until eternity. But what do we do? How do we fix it? And I'll turn it over to Brandon to kind of talk about what's next and how we're really pushing back against hate, how we're pushing back against anti-Semitism and white supremacy. I'm gonna let Brandon talk about it a little, and I'll put a couple of just, real world opportunities to get in there, get in community, get involved, especially leading up to the election, and defending democracy, which goes part and parcel with everything that we've been talking about. Tal, I've learned so much from you tonight. I know the rest of us have as well, but since I have the floor, I wanted to be the one to get to actually say it directly to you. But I'm going to kick it back to Brandon to close us out.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tal. And like, it's taken everything in my power not to just be like a complete super fan this entire time. I've been following your content, your whatever we call it in this hyper online world. I think since you ended up, what was it? You got like Rudy Giuliani's number, and you said you were a spunky reporter from the Daily Planet. And that's when I first started following you on Twitter. And I've learned so much from you, from all of the other writers and journalists that you also share. And I encourage everybody, like, one, buy that book and read it. It is fantastic. Get it for your friends. I have forcibly gotten it for like every member of my family the last like 2 holiday seasons. Also,
yes,
if you like,
absolutely, I agree.
yeah, it's good to have some agreement, right? And also, if you really like learning from Tal, like, and you're not like a Twitter person, which is totally valid, it's a garbage place that is full of nightmares. Check out their Substack. Substack, for those who don't know what it is, it's basically like a blog newsletter. And Tal is writing about all of this stuff all of the time, but because the world, reading about these horrible things can be a lot. So kindly, Tal includes an article just about a sandwich every Friday. So as we break for Shabbat, we can just read about a different sandwich from around the world. And those have definitely gotten me through some rougher weeks of just like having to just consume the online discourse. So I highly recommend it. And then lastly, what does Jewish Community Action do? What do we do? Well, what can us, a little tiny nonprofit of like 10 people, we barely have a minion. What can we do? Of course, we do, for those who know us, we do a lot of democracy defense work. Every election season, we're out there just talking to folks in a nonpartisan fashion about the importance of elections or specific ballot issues. So Beth has shared in the chat a couple of our upcoming door knocks, and highly encourage you to check them out. If you just really love the JCA staff, tomorrow we are having a in-person event at our lovely new office. We moved there during the pandemic. It is huge, much bigger than our old one. And we will be saying goodbye to our comms director, Jonathan Gershberg, and welcoming our brand new comms director, Milo. And I hope to see you all there. I'm going to be rushing down from this labor conference I'm at in Brainerd just to get there in time to see everybody. And of course, my programming with the Combating Hate Coalition, you can always check out what we're doing. We've got new book clubs coming all the time. I'm hoping to have more events like this where we bring in writers and journalists, maybe even TikTokers who talk about this stuff. Who knows what cool friends I've made online that I can bring out here. Please register, check it out, buy Tal's book, and yeah, hit subscribe on that Substack just for the sandwich content alone. But truly, it's great being able to go and read things that make you feel like you're not just staring at the world, not feeling like everything's on fire and not even understanding why.
That's me explaining the abyss. Yeah, I think also just like the community work you do with the door knocking and talking and book clubs, like, I mean, the stuff I do is like very esoteric and online, and like I love being able to explain the horrors to people, but like the kind of work you guys do where you are reaching out and talking to people is like so vital, especially at this moment. So kudos to you guys for everything you do, and for the trainings that you do, and thank you for inviting me out. What a lovely opportunity to get to know some new friends in the Twin Cities, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for tolerating my New York speed of speech, where I'm just like, I'm gonna try to cram as many concepts as I can into a single sentence really quickly. But thank you so much, Brandon, and really, like, best of luck. And if anyone from any future Cultural Warlords book clubs has any questions, like feel free to email me. And what a lovely night. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Tal. And the one last thing I want to tell you is that coming out of our book clubs both times, I think we have completed the book, and several people who otherwise thought that Antifa was just these hooligans who wear black masks and are ne'er-do-wells ended that book saying, gosh, I want to be an Antifa. And I find that beautiful. And I hope that
Yay.
brings you joy.
Well, I consider myself a ne'er-do-well, but like I would never brand other anti-fascists that way. Anyway, thank you so much, you guys, and have a lovely night. Okay.
Have a great
Bye.
night, everybody.